It started with the sound of engines, low, guttural, and growing louder by the second. Most folks in Thunder Creek looked up from their coffee or paused mid-conversation, instinctively tightening their jaws and glancing toward the source of the noise. They came in a swarm. 13 bikes, matte black and dripping chrome, weaving down Main Street like a pack of wolves that had just caught the scent of blood. No license plates on the back, just red vulture emblems spread wide across their jackets, wings outstretched and talons down. The Red Vulture's MC had arrived. At first, nobody said a word, just watched as the gang rolled past the old church, past the diner, past the town square where families took holiday photos. Their presence was loud, not just in sound, but in intent. The way they rode, slow, deliberate, unblinking, broadcast a single message: we're not here to visit. The leader, Vince Maddox, known to most as Torch, sat atop a massive Harley with handlebars that rose like horns. His eyes were hidden behind reflective aviators, but his smirk said everything. This was a man used to fear bending the world his way. Torch lit a cigarette right there in the middle of the town's War Memorial Plaza. Didn't even bother to take off his helmet. Just struck the match against the base of the monument and leaned back as if daring someone to object. No one did. Not the pastor who watched from the church steps, not the waitress clutching her apron on the diner porch, and not the young cop standing near the pharmacy who reached for his radio and then thought better of it. For the next 3 days, they made their presence felt. Nothing too overt at first, just loud engines outside businesses, slow circles around the high school, dark figures showing up at closing time and lingering like storm clouds before a downpour. Then came the demands. First, it was free coffee, then fuel, then donations to help keep the town safe from outsiders. And always, always the same final warning. It'd be a shame if anything happened. The people of Thunder Creek had seen tough before. They'd been through blizzards, floods, the slow death of the lumber mill. But nothing like this. Fear doesn't always come with fists or shouts. Sometimes it wears a grin, speaks softly, and hands you a handshake that feels more like a chain tightening around your neck. By the end of the first week, business owners were leaving cash envelopes in their mail slots without being asked. The sheriff, a good man past retirement age, quietly stopped patrolling Main after sunset, and the mayor called a closed-door meeting that produced no plan, no courage, just silence. Then came the night they lit the flag. It was 2 a.m., cool and quiet. Most of the town was asleep. The only light came from the soft yellow of street lamps and the flickering neon sign from Mary's Diner. That's when 3 vultures pulled up to Keller's Hardware. They didn't say a word, just got off their bikes, walked up to the flagpole that had stood untouched for nearly 4 decades, and pulled the flag down. One of them, the lanky one with a spider tattoo across his throat, pulled out a Zippo. With one flick, the flame caught the edge of the fabric. Red, white, and blue curled inward and blackened under the fire. They left it there, a smoldering pile at the foot of the pole. Nobody saw it happen, or so they thought. But the next morning, when townspeople came out and saw the ashes where Old Glory had once flown, they didn't just feel fear. They felt something else, something colder, a chill that went deeper than intimidation. Because Keller's Hardware wasn't just a store, and that flag wasn't just cloth, and Frank Keller wasn't just another old man, not by a long shot. What the vultures didn't know, what they couldn't have known, is that they hadn't just burned a flag. They had desecrated a battlefield relic, a banner that had once flown above a field hospital on the border of Laos. That had been folded and unfolded across continents. That had shielded wounded men from sun and sand and shrapnel. That had been soaked in blood and still flown high. And the man who'd brought it back had just been handed a reason to stop pretending he was done fighting. Everything was about to change, but the vultures hadn't realized they'd just thrown their match into a powder keg. Frank Keller didn't look like much. That's what made him dangerous. To the kids at the high school, he was the old guy who fixed squeaky hinges and handed out advice no one asked for. To the town's newcomers, He was just the man behind the counter at Keller's Hardware, quiet, polite, and a little slow-moving. He walked with a slight limp that never quite healed right, wore the same brown work boots every day, and still wrote receipts by hand. He had no family nearby, no flashy car, and no presence on social media. He was a fixture, like the cracked pavement on Main or the rusted bell outside the firehouse. Always there, always fading into the background, until someone pushed him too far. Most of the town didn't know that Frank had once been Colonel Francis Keller of the United States Army, commander of Ghost Company, 3rd Battalion, Special Operations. A legend whispered about in jungle outposts and forward operating bases. The kind of soldier who didn't just follow orders, he made the impossible look routine. There were stories, rescue missions behind enemy lines, entire platoons extracted from hopeless ambushes, a night in Da Nang where Keller flew a damaged Huey through a storm of gunfire to pull out 7 wounded men and 1 unconscious medic. Stories, but no proof. Because Frank never talked about the war. He didn't hang his medals in the store, didn't wear his old patches, didn't sit around the diner trading stories. He didn't need to. He'd done what needed doing, and when the time came to come home, he did so with no fanfare, no parade, just a battered duffel bag, a folded flag, and silence. What he did carry, every single day, was discipline. His routine was sacred. Up at 5, coffee at 5:30, doors unlocked at 6. At precisely 6:15, he'd step outside and raise the flag. The same flag every morning. Rain or shine, snow or wind. He'd check the ropes, unclip the fasteners, unfurl the fabric with both hands like he was handling something sacred. He'd pause for a breath, just a breath, and then pull the line smooth and slow until the stars and stripes snapped to life in the morning air. A small thing, but it meant everything. He never said it aloud, but those who watched could see it in his posture. That flag had weight. Not just physical, it carried names, stories, promises, ghosts. No one asked where the flag came from, maybe out of respect, maybe because they already knew it wasn't from a store shelf. It had been patched, restitched along one edge, and faded in places. But Frank treated it like it had never once seen damage. That flag had flown in battle, over camps and fields and makeshift landing zones. It had been folded and unfolded over the bodies of friends. It had come home with him, not in a box or a duffel, but clutched in his hands, held like something alive. He'd carried it through hell, and every morning in Thunder Creek, he raised it not out of habit, but out of duty. A quiet ritual that reminded him, and maybe a few others, of what still mattered. The morning after the vultures burned it, Frank found the ashes scattered like dead leaves at the base of the pole. He didn't kneel, didn't speak, just stood there, staring at the blackened remnants of the cloth he'd once folded with trembling hands over the chest of a fallen medic. The wind blew a few flakes toward his boots. He reached down, brushed them gently into a small box, and carried it inside without a word. He didn't close the store that day. He opened it on time, took inventory like always, and helped a customer find the right type of chain for a swing set. But something behind his eyes had shifted. Not anger, not sadness, something colder, something quieter. People noticed. Mary Ellen across the street kept glancing through her diner window like she was waiting for something. The postman stopped in and didn't linger. Even the local cop, Officer Durbin, came by just to say hello and left with a nervous smile. What none of them saw was what happened after dark, after Frank turned the closed sign and bolted the front door. He pulled out a chair in the back office, sat down in front of a box marked personal, and opened it for the first time in years. Inside were a few things: a photo of his old unit, a worn field map with grease pencil markings, a pocket Bible missing its cover, and a list of names, handwritten, yellowed, and folded many times. At the very bottom, hidden beneath the photo, was a small black notebook. It had one number written inside. No name, no address. Just a 10-digit number and a faded note beside it, if you ever need the ghosts. Frank picked up the phone. It rang once, Twice. Then a voice answered, gravelly, clipped, "Go." Frank didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. "It's Keller." A pause. Then the voice changed, from suspicion to recognition. "I thought you were done." "I was." Another pause. "What's the situation?" "They burned my flag." Silence. Then 5 words that changed everything. "Where do you need us?" The line went quiet for a long second, like the man on the other end needed to recalibrate something deep inside, like the name Keller had pulled him back through time, back through sand and sweat and blood, to a place he thought he'd left buried for good. Then his voice came again, calmer, steel-wrapped, the way men talk when they've already made a decision. "Where do you need us?" Not what happened, not are you sure, not who did it, just where and when, because that was the kind of bond Frank had built decades ago, under jungle canopies and in bullet-laced night skies, with men who didn't run when it got hard, men who only needed a direction. "Thunder Creek," Frank said. "Main Street, Anderson County, population maybe 400, but it won't be for long if this keeps up." Another pause, shorter this time. "Same group from up north?" Frank leaned back in his chair, staring at the burnt corner of the flag box resting near his feet. "They're calling themselves the Red Vultures. I've counted at least 16, maybe more, coming in from out of state. Leader calls himself Torch, real name's Maddox. They've been shaking down half the town. This morning they burned my flag." His voice stayed level, but underneath there was a quiet edge sharp enough to cut through bone. "They burned it on my doorstep." That's all it took. "Copy that," the voice said. 10 hours. You'll see the first wave in 6. We'll bring the rest by nightfall. You still got the contacts list?" "Still do," Frank said, already reaching into the drawer. "Then make the calls. We're waking the ghosts." And just like that, the past was no longer in the past. Frank hung up and stared at the rotary dial for a moment. It had been years since he'd used it for anything other than ordering paint shipments or calling the diner for a lunch order. But that night, it would serve its original purpose again, to connect soldiers, to rally a unit, to call home men who had no home unless someone needed saving. He pulled the black notebook toward him, flipped past scribbled notes and half-faded pages, and started at the top of the list. Each name brought back a face, a memory, a scar, and one by one he dialed. Some of them didn't answer right away, but when they did, the responses came fast and firm. "You got it, Frank. Say when. I'm on the bike already." "If they touch the flag, they've already lost." He called Texas, then Idaho, Georgia, then Michigan. He skipped over no one, not even the names he hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. Because if ever there was a moment to call in every marker, every favor, every life owed and debt unpaid, it was now. By the time he reached the 3rd page of the notebook, the sun had started to rise, casting long orange lines across the wooden floor of his office. Outside, Thunder Creek stirred. People went to work, opened shop, drove past his store with that look of cautious avoidance. They hadn't seen what was coming, but Frank had. Across the country, in garages and barns and tool sheds, men opened boxes labeled "Military Stuff Do Not Touch." They unzipped duffel bags sealed since the Gulf, or the jungle, or the desert. They pulled on vests with faded patches, tightened laces on boots older than their youngest kids, cleaned weapons long retired but never forgotten. In quiet suburbs and dusty back roads, they turned keys in ignition switches that hadn't clicked in years, and the engines came alive like sleeping giants roused from slumber. Bikes rolled out onto highways before breakfast was even on the table. Not just Harley-Davidsons, but custom jobs, patched tanks, dented frames covered in stickers from long-gone towns. Some rode solo, others in pairs. None of them had to ask directions, because they knew Frank. And if Frank had called, it meant something was broken. And if something was broken, they would fix it. At Keller's Hardware, Frank stepped out of the office and into the sunlight. He walked to the flagpole, now stripped bare, and stood at attention. No flag to raise today, but he stood there just the same. out of respect, out of memory. The flag was gone, but the duty wasn't, and soon neither would be the men who'd sworn to protect everything it stood for. 6 hours later, the first bikes rolled into town. They didn't come with sirens or flashing lights. No speeches, no declarations. Just a long, rumbling line of men in weathered denim and leather, their eyes hard, their patches faded, their purpose clear. They didn't look around. Didn't need to. They just pulled up to Keller's, nodded once to the man standing out front, and began forming a wall. Torch Maddox, sipping a beer 2 blocks away, looked up when he heard the engines, smirked when he saw the line of bikes growing by the minute. "Cute," he muttered. "Brought in some old-timers." He didn't understand. Not yet. Not what had been set in motion. Because Frank hadn't just made a phone call. He'd made the call, the one that woke up every quiet warrior still out there, just waiting for a reason. And now they were coming. They didn't come all at once. They never did. That wasn't the way these men moved. The ones who answered Frank Keller's call showed up like ghosts, exactly when they meant to, and never a moment early. The first few trickled in before dusk. No fanfare, no music, no raised voices, just the low, steady rumble of engines echoing through the streets of Thunder Creek. Locals stopped what they were doing, turned their heads, and watched with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something like awe. Because these riders weren't like the Red Vultures. They didn't swerve down the middle of the street or rev their engines at the diner windows. They didn't wear patches designed to intimidate. What they wore was older, heavier, more worn down by years of use and something deeper than fashion. The patches were quiet, but they said everything. Some bore the insignia of special operations units, others old cavalry regiments. Some had no patch at all, just a simple American flag stitched to the back, or the ghost of one long faded by sun and time. One of the first to arrive was a man named Donovan, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, and riding a black Triumph that still bore the sand dust from Utah. He didn't even ask where to go. He just parked outside Keller's Hardware, got off the bike, and reached out to shake Frank's hand. No words passed between them at first, just a firm grip between two men who'd been through too much to waste time with small talk. Donovan looked around at the street, then at the scorched flagpole. His jaw clenched. "They really did it?" he asked. Frank just nodded and handed him the box of ashes. Donovan took it with both hands, held it for a second longer than necessary, and whispered, "Hell of a mistake." By nightfall, there were 17 bikes lined up outside the store. Each one brought a piece of Frank's past with it. Men he'd led, men he'd rescued, men who'd once followed his orders in places that didn't have names, just coordinates and blood. They hadn't seen each other in years, but the moment they stood shoulder to shoulder again, the years fell away. Muscle memory kicked in. Eyes sharpened. Hands twitched into position on belt loops and boot heels. You could feel it in the air, something dangerous but controlled. Inside the diner, Mary Ellen poured coffee with trembling hands. She kept glancing out the window, watching as more of them arrived. By the time she closed up, the sidewalk was lined with more than 30 veterans, all stationed like sentries around Keller's store. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Townspeople stayed back, but watched with growing curiosity. It was like seeing a battalion appear out of thin air, a force that didn't need badges or guns on display to make their point. Even the town's teens, usually glued to their phones, slowed their bikes and scooters when they passed. They didn't know what exactly was happening, but they felt it. Everyone did. Something was changing. Something had come alive. Down at the edge of town, the Red Vultures watched too. Torch Maddox sat on the hood of a beat-up Crown Vic outside their makeshift clubhouse, cigarette burning low between his fingers. He'd heard the bikes, seen the riders. One of his boys had even tried tailing a group that came in from the west, only to come back shaking his head. "These ain't normal old men, boss," he'd said. "They move like a unit." Torch had laughed it off, but the edge in his voice had started to fray. "What do you mean, like a unit?" he snapped. "They're grandpas on motorcycles. "They took position, boss," the kid replied. "Didn't talk, didn't look around, just parked, grouped up, and started watching. Clockwise coverage, defensive posture." He swallowed hard. "I've seen videos of this stuff. Military stuff." Torch had dismissed it, but later, in private, he called up a name. One of his contacts upstate, a guy who'd done time with ex-military types. "Frank Keller," he said into the burner phone. "Old vet out in Anderson County. Know the name?" There was a pause. Then the voice on the line said, "You've got problems, brother." "How bad?" "That's Ghost Company bad." The silence that followed stretched thin and cold. Torch didn't speak. He didn't have to, because now he understood what was moving against him wasn't just a group of angry locals or a bunch of washed-up soldiers reliving their glory days. It was something older, meaner, sharper. These weren't just veterans. These were men who had survived things far worse than outlaw gangs, and they hadn't shown up because of a turf war. They'd come because someone burned a flag, and that flag had belonged to one of their own. By midnight, Thunder Creek was holding its breath. More bikes continued to arrive, their engines low and respectful as they pulled into town. They didn't need to be loud. Their silence spoke volumes. By the time the street lamps started to dim, Frank had welcomed over 40 men back into his life. They brought sleeping bags, duffels, and memories. They shook hands with townspeople when offered nods when not. They camped behind the hardware store, in the lot next door, even in the old firehouse. And by morning, Thunder Creek would wake to something it hadn't felt in weeks: safety. Frank sat on the bench outside his store, arms resting on his knees, watching the night pass like an old friend. Around him, the ghosts moved quietly, like they always had. No orders, just instinct. They were back, and the last time they'd assembled like this, it had been in the middle of a war zone. This time, the battlefield had a zip code, and the mission was personal. The sun rose slow over Thunder Creek, painting long amber streaks across Main Street, and for the first time in weeks, the town didn't wake to the growl of the red vultures claiming the streets as their own. Instead, what people saw when they stepped outside were rows of motorcycles parked with purpose, kickstands dug into gravel like bayonets planted in the earth. Some bore decals worn nearly invisible by time, others gleamed with fresh polish, but every one of them had one thing in common: they'd been ridden in with intention. This wasn't a weekend ride or a show of force. It was a statement. Inside Keller's hardware, Frank stood behind the counter with his hands resting lightly on the edge, not in tension, but in readiness. Behind him, a small chalkboard listed the daily specials, same as always: shovel handles, paint thinner, garden hose adapters, but there was something different in the air. Veterans moved around the shop not like customers, but like soldiers securing a field base. Some checked entry points, others marked choke points on paper maps spread across the back counter. One man, quiet and meticulous, had set up a comms rig using 2 portable radios and a hardwired line spliced into the back wall, as casually as if he were installing a light switch. Across the street, the townspeople watched with a mixture of disbelief and cautious relief. No one had asked these men to do anything. No contracts had been signed. But the presence alone was doing more than the sheriff's department had managed in months. Windows were opening, storefronts unlocked on time. People dared to gather outside the diner again, sipping coffee not in fear, but with curiosity. Conversations that had become whispers were turning into questions. Who were these men? Why were they here? Were they really with Frank? And then the veterans began doing something no one expected. They started helping. By mid-morning, 2 of them had changed the flat tire on Mrs. Billings' truck without being asked. Another pair helped Tom Mason haul a refrigerator up the steps of his shop, something the vultures had offered to do weeks earlier for $200. The veterans asked for nothing. They didn't smile much, but they didn't need to. Their actions were loud enough. Torch Maddox, watching from his hideout on the north end of town, wasn't laughing anymore. The swagger that had made him untouchable in Thunder Creek was slipping like oil from a cracked pan. He hadn't expected resistance, not real resistance. When he first heard Keller's name, he'd shrugged it off. Some old vet, probably hard of hearing, maybe slow to anger. He figured the man had barked back out of pride, not power. But that was before the bikes arrived, before his guys started reporting how these old-timers were moving like trained units. And now, word was spreading that more were on the way. Torch gathered his corps lieutenants, Scab, Iron Mike, Razor, and Twitch, into the back room of the old warehouse they used as a clubhouse. It reeked of beer and gasoline. Maps of town were spread out on the table, with circles drawn around their usual haunts: the gas station, the train yard, the strip of bars along Elm. Torch pointed at Keller's store with a blade-tip marker. "That's where it's bleeding from," he growled. "They're using the old man's place like it's a command center, like they're setting up for war. I want them rattled. I want to remind them whose town this is." Scab, always the loudest in the room, leaned forward. "We rough up a couple shops again? Maybe torch the diner? Send a message?" "No," Torch snapped. "That won't do it. This isn't about fire anymore. It's about fear. We can't just act like punks with lighters. We've got to make them doubt. Make the town remember who's in charge." He stood, pacing. "We need to go to the source." That afternoon, 2 vultures cruised slow past the school. Another group drove by the town hall, glaring through tinted visors. They didn't stop, didn't say a word, but the message was clear. We're still here. We're watching. But what they didn't realize was that every time they rolled past, a veteran clocked them, logged their route, took note of patterns, license plate numbers, direction of approach, and behavior. One of the ghosts even followed a pair of them back to a stash house hidden in the woods west of town. No sirens, no lights, just observation. Silent, thorough, professional. At the edge of evening, the veterans gathered at the town square. Frank didn't call a meeting. It just happened. A few more bikes had arrived, some from the south, some from the coast, and those who couldn't ride had driven in battered pickups or hitched trailers with fold-out cots and camo tents. There were 52 of them now, not all soldiers, not all from Ghost Company, but every one of them had served, and every one of them knew what a show of force looked like. More importantly, they knew what discipline felt like. Frank stood in front of the statue at the square's center, an old bronze soldier from World War I, his rifle lowered, face solemn. The town had long since forgotten who the statue was modeled after, but in that moment it didn't matter. Frank looked around the circle of men and gave a nod. "We're not here to scare the town," he said quietly. "We're here to remind it." A murmur of agreement moved through the group. Boots scuffed on the pavement. Gloves tightened. Eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus. These were men who'd fought under worse odds, and now they were fighting not for medals or strategy or land, but for something simpler: respect, for a flag, for a friend. Torch, watching from a nearby rooftop through binoculars, lowered the lens with a frown. "They're planning something," he muttered. He wasn't wrong, but what he didn't realize, what he couldn't realize, was that these men didn't need to plan chaos. They planned order, and that was far more dangerous, because chaos burns itself out. But order takes root. The tension broke just after midnight, not with a bang, but with the sharp clatter of a glass bottle shattering against brick. The sound echoed down the empty street like a starter pistol, sudden and deliberate. Flames bloomed from the alley wall beside Keller's Hardware, licking upward like hungry tongues toward the faded sign above the door. For a heartbeat, the fire stood alone in the darkness. Then came the engines. The red vultures were moving, finally shedding the subtlety they'd clung to for days. They came howling through town like a storm with purpose, tires shrieking, headlights off, faces masked. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. This was an attack. From 3 directions they closed in, 2 groups on bikes, 1 on foot, slipping down back alleys with cans of gasoline and rags soaked in accelerant. One headed straight for Mary Ellen's diner, another toward the auto shop, and the third made a beeline for Keller's. Torch wasn't riding tonight. He was standing atop the old hardware warehouse 2 streets over, watching it unfold like a general overseeing a siege. His arms were crossed, his expression hard. "Let's see what ghosts do when you light up their graveyard," he muttered to no one. But what Torch didn't know, what he'd never understand, was that the veterans had already seen the storm coming. They hadn't been idle these past few days. While the town watched, they had mapped routes, posted silent guards, and drilled entry points. Every alley had been measured, every blind spot accounted for. They had turned Thunder Creek into a defensive grid without ever raising their voices. So, when the vultures moved, the response wasn't panic. It was precision. The first group to strike was the one heading for the diner. 3 bikes tore down the lane behind the building, skidding to a halt beside the trash bins. One rider leapt off, a lit bottle in hand, and raised it to throw, only to freeze as a single red dot settled on his chest. Another appeared on the back of his hand, then a third. No commands, no shouting, just the soft click of safeties releasing in the shadows. The rider's hand trembled. He lowered the bottle. Behind a parked truck, Sergeant Torres gave a slow shake of the head. Not tonight. On the opposite side of town, the group approaching the auto shop found the road narrowed by 2 old pickups parked diagonally, too close to navigate through at speed. They tried to reverse but found more vehicles behind them, headlights suddenly flaring to life and blinding their escape route. From the rooftops, veterans appeared like silhouettes, not armed to kill, but armed to control. They didn't fire. They didn't need to. The vultures didn't know where to look. Every alley was covered. Every window had eyes. It wasn't just about being surrounded, it was about being outmatched. At Keller's Hardware, the fire spread a little farther before it was answered. Not by sirens, but by boots on the ground. Donovan and Cooper were already in motion, fire extinguishers in hand, hoses snaking out from the side of the building like veins. Flames hissed and died under white spray. Smoke billowed, but it carried no triumph, only failure. As the last of the fire sputtered out, the veterans stepped into the street, forming a silent wall in front of the store. Frank stood at the center, his hands empty, his expression unreadable. Then came the moment no one expected. The third team of vultures, those on foot who had tried to flank from the west, suddenly found themselves caught, not by men with weapons, but by townspeople. Ordinary citizens who had been watching from their windows, galvanized by the calm control of the veterans. Tom Mason stepped out with a wrench in hand, flanked by 2 of his shop mechanics. Mary Ellen appeared at the edge of the street, holding nothing but a flashlight. But her eyes didn't flinch. Even the sheriff, old but not broken, blocked the alley with his cruiser, lights spinning. The vultures didn't fight. They backed away. One by one, they dropped their cans. One by one, they vanished into the dark. Only Torch remained, alone on his rooftop perch, watching the attack crumble like dry leaves in the wind. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched. This was supposed to scare them, humiliate them. Instead, it had shown his men something he couldn't afford them to see, that he wasn't the strongest presence in town anymore. Back at Keller's, Frank took a step forward, the veterans parting slightly to let him pass. He walked to the edge of the sidewalk where the scorched wall still smoked behind him. He looked out at the empty street, then up at the flagpole. The rope was blackened, the pulley twisted from heat, but the pole still stood. And so did he. Cooper moved beside him, his voice quiet. They tested the line. Frank nodded once, and found it didn't move. A few blocks away, the vultures regrouped in their hideout. Some were silent, others muttering nervously. One of them, barely 20, was shaking as he peeled off his gloves. They weren't scared, he whispered. Not even a little. Another rider dropped onto a couch, his head in his hands. They knew we were coming. Torch walked through them, not speaking. He could feel it. The shift, the fracture. His power had been built on the idea that he was the apex predator in every room, that people would always fear chaos more than they respected order, but now he was watching as that foundation cracked beneath him, piece by piece, and it all started with a phone call to a man he'd dismissed as just another relic of a forgotten war. He grabbed the map off the wall and tore it down, sending pushpins scattering across the floor. He didn't have a plan anymore, just rage. But Frank Keller had a plan, and he had brothers. And now everyone in town had seen what happened when men like them drew a line in the sand and dared someone to cross it. The attack hadn't broken the town, it had unified it, and the war for Thunder Creek had only just begun. Morning came, not softly, but with purpose. The sky above Thunder Creek cracked open in gold and orange, stretching long beams of sunlight across rooftops and shattered glass, the kind that carries the promise of clarity after a long night of fire and noise. But the town wasn't stirring from fear anymore. It woke with eyes open, backs straighter, the echo of engines still fresh in their memory. No one had slept much. Some hadn't slept at all. But for the first time in weeks, the silence of the early hours didn't feel like the calm before another threat. It felt like the breath right before a counterpunch. Down at Keller's Hardware, Frank was already outside, broom in hand, sweeping the ashes from the front step. His movements were deliberate, steady, just like always. If you'd only just arrived in town, you might have thought he was cleaning up after a small campfire or a dusty windstorm. But those watching, those who knew, understood that this was his ritual, his reset. You burn his flag, you threaten his town, you bring gasoline and hate to his doorstep, and he still sweeps his threshold with the same calm hands he'd used to load medkits under mortar fire. Not because it didn't matter, but because it did. Order, routine, dignity. These were his weapons, sharper than any blade. Behind him, the veterans moved through their morning protocols. Donovan was coordinating a rotation at the west checkpoint, while Torres distributed water and fresh coffee to the men posted through the night. Cooper had taken a crew to survey the perimeter, checking for damage, re-establishing sight lines. Nothing was left to chance. The veterans didn't gloat about repelling the vultures. They didn't high-five or brag or count their wins. Because they hadn't come to prove anything, they'd come to defend something. Word of the failed attack had traveled fast. By mid-morning, half the town knew what had happened, even if they hadn't seen it firsthand. And what they knew had begun to shift something deep inside them. The fear that had wrapped around their spines for weeks had begun to loosen. Some, like Mary Ellen, had opened their doors with a kind of reverence, setting out extra coffee for the men she now called our soldiers. Others, quiet men like Tom Mason, offered what they could: tools, hands, support. Even kids had noticed. A group of teenagers who once rode their bikes fast past the vultures out of fear now stood on the sidewalk watching the veterans work, whispering names and pointing out insignias like they were seeing superheroes in real life. But not everyone was reacting with admiration. Across town, in the Red Vulture's clubhouse, Torch was unraveling. His voice carried down the concrete halls, barking orders with a sharpness that no longer sounded authoritative, just desperate. Half his men had gone silent after the failed assault, avoiding eye contact, whispering in pairs. A few hadn't come back at all, the ones who had spoke about red dots appearing on their chests before they could act, about veterans appearing out of nowhere, moving with discipline they couldn't match. One of them, Twitch, had sat in the corner most of the night staring at his boots, finally muttering, "They didn't blink, not once. We were loud, they were ready." Torch slammed his fists on the table. "They're old men, you hear me? Old. What? They scare you 'cause they don't flinch? You think they're invincible?" Razor, always one of the more level-headed, glanced up and said something Torch didn't want to hear. "They move like they've done this before, like we just walked into their drill." That's when Torch made a decision. He wouldn't lose Thunder Creek by inches. He wouldn't let fear erode his control, especially not to ghosts and memory. He would strike hard, something big, something loud, something that would remind the town that the vultures weren't going away quietly. Back at Keller's, Frank was speaking with Cooper and a handful of others when the call came in. It wasn't from the police. It came from an old number patched through from a friend in another county. A whisper about the vultures pulling in support from outside, reinforcements, different patches, same tactics. Torch had started calling in debts, rallying smaller outfits from neighboring towns, those who'd heard about Thunder Creek and wanted to come watch the fire. Maybe pour gas on it. Frank listened, nodded once, and turned back to his men. "It's not over," he said. "He's regrouping." Donovan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "We figured." "Wants a show of power," Cooper added. "Something to spook us." "Won't work," Frank replied. "But that doesn't mean we wait for him to strike again." He stepped forward, placing a hand on the map they'd pinned to the wall of the store. Thunder Creek, and the roads in and out. "We're not just holding the line anymore. We're drawing new ones. From here on out, he moves, we know. He breathes wrong, we're watching." It wasn't just a defensive posture now, it was control. The veterans began dividing into structured patrols, not to provoke, but to protect. Street by street they coordinated with locals. Neighborhood watches transformed into small trained squads, radios distributed, check-ins scheduled. The town was no longer waiting to be saved. It was learning how to stand on its own. And that, more than anything, rattled Torch the most. Because this was no longer about dominance. It was about community, and a community led by veterans who knew war, who'd seen it up close and still chose discipline over destruction. That kind of force didn't need to prove anything. It just was. The next night, Frank stood again in front of his store, sweeping the sidewalk. The wind was cool, the stars bright. A new flag, donated by a fellow veteran, fluttered above him. This one hadn't seen combat, but it had already survived an attempted erasure, and now it stood taller than ever. Behind Frank, on rooftops and sidewalks and porches, the ghosts kept watch, not because they were told to, but because they chose to. And for the first time since the Red Vultures rolled into Thunder Creek, the question wasn't if the town would survive. It was how long it would take the gang to realize they'd already lost. The phone call came in just after 2 in the morning. Frank was in the back office, going over supply lists and field notes from earlier patrols when the quiet buzz of the emergency line broke the silence. He answered on the first ring, already bracing himself. On the other end, Torres' voice came through. Low, tight, alert. "Movement on the North Ridge. Convoy. 3 bikes, 1 van. Lights off. No plates." That was all Frank needed to hear. He stood up slowly, shoulders straightening beneath the weight of memory and responsibility. "Maintain distance," he said. "Do not engage. I'll send Cooper and Riley to intercept near the east trailhead. We'll handle the approach from town." By the time Frank stepped outside, the rest of the veterans were already moving. No need to shout, no need to bark commands. These weren't rookies or cowboys. They were soldiers. One look at Frank's face, and they understood what it meant. An intrusion, a test. Torch had reached out to the darker corners of the world, and now they were sending scouts, probing Thunder Creek's edges for weak spots, like wolves nudging the fence line, looking for a place to slip in. Cooper pulled up in a truck within minutes, already dressed, rifle slung but unloaded, gear bag in the passenger seat. "Got eyes from the ridge," he said. "Looks like new blood, different patches, not red vultures, but friends of friends. You know the type." Frank climbed into the passenger seat, nodding. "Yeah, hired trouble." They drove in silence for a few minutes, the hum of the engine soft beneath the vast Montana sky. Out here, the darkness wasn't just a backdrop, it was a living thing. Fields stretched forever in every direction, broken only by fences and the occasional barn long since swallowed by time. But in that silence, the veterans operated with the kind of confidence only earned by facing worse than this. They didn't fear what was coming, they prepared for it. Meanwhile, Torch sat in the back of the Vulture's compound, pacing between crates of stolen parts and empty beer bottles, growing more erratic by the hour. His men had seen the cracks form, watched the ego that held his empire together begin to strain. He shouted orders that contradicted each other, demanded loyalty while questioning everyone's motives, and paced with the jittery edge of a man who knew the tide had turned and couldn't figure out how to stop the flood. The new recruits he'd called in were mercenaries, outlaws from other counties, some from across the state line. They hadn't come for ideology or territory, they'd come for money. And now, realizing this wasn't the easy pickings they were promised, they were growing restless. One of them, a tattooed rider named Axel, had already voiced his doubt. "You told us this was just some hick town with soft bellies and scared cops," he said. "But it's crawling with ex-military. They've got formation, radios, overwatch. This isn't a gang war. This is a damn operation." Torch snapped back. "We outnumber them." "No," Axel replied. "You don't. Not anymore. You outnumber civilians. But these guys, they don't fight alone." Torch didn't have an answer for that. He just turned away, muttering something under his breath that no one could hear. But his silence said everything. For the first time, even he wasn't sure he still had control. Back near the ridge, Cooper and Frank parked just shy of the tree line, lights off. They approached on foot, careful and quiet, each step falling where instinct told them it should. They spotted the newcomers within minutes, 3 riders and 1 man leaning against the open side door of the van, puffing on a cigarette, watching the darkness like he expected it to answer back. Frank didn't draw a weapon. He just stepped forward into the open, hands visible. "Long ride to be out here with no plates," he said evenly. The man at the van flinched. The riders turned their heads. For a second, no one spoke. Then one of them, bigger, maybe early 30s, beard thick and patchy, stepped forward with an attempt at swagger. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who knows when trouble's about to make a wrong turn," Frank replied. "Turn around. Go back to whoever sent you. Tell them the ground's different here." The man sneered. "You think you scare me?" Frank didn't blink. "Number. But I'm not the one you should be worried about." Behind him, Cooper emerged from the shadows, then Riley, then Torres from the ridge above. None of them carried weapons drawn, but the way they moved, the way they stood, it made the point. They weren't trying to intimidate. They didn't need to. They were simply ready, prepared, and that, more than anything, unnerved the newcomers. The man at the van dropped his cigarette and ground it out with his boot. "This ain't our fight," he muttered. "Didn't sign up for a standoff with veterans." "Then don't start one," Frank said. "Go home." One of the bikers mounted up without another word. The others followed, grumbling but no longer posturing. As they rode off, Frank turned back toward the town, the quiet buzz of a radio breaking the stillness in his ear. "East perimeter clear," came the update. "Local patrols in place. Town's calm. For now." Back in Thunder Creek, the mood had shifted again. Word had spread. The veterans had turned back another threat, without bloodshed, without noise. And it wasn't just the veterans doing the work anymore. Civilians had stepped up, watching from porches, organizing neighborhood alerts, walking their streets with flashlights and eyes sharp. Not vigilantes, not wannabe heroes, just people rediscovering their backbone, their voice. And that was the part Torch couldn't fight. He could scare individuals, he could bully a business owner, but he couldn't stop a town that remembered what it meant to stand together. That night, Frank sat outside the store again, the flag overhead catching the soft wind. He wasn't alone. A half-dozen veterans sat around him, sipping coffee, watching the street in calm silence. Behind them, lights glowed in homes that hadn't felt safe in weeks, and in those homes were people who, just days before, had wondered if they were about to lose their town. Now they knew the answer, not without a fight, and not while Frank Keller and his brothers still stood. The thunder wasn't from the sky. It came rolling in from the east just before dawn, low and steady, like a drumbeat built from iron and memory. Not the frantic roar of gang bikes tearing through town to intimidate or mark territory. This was something else entirely. It was too measured, too in sync, too vast. One rumble became 2, then 10, then 50. By the time the first light touched the edges of Thunder Creek's rooftops, the sound had filled the valley, an approaching force that didn't ask for attention, but demanded respect. Frank Keller stood outside the hardware store, the rising wind lifting the corner of his coat. He watched the horizon where Route 9 curved down from the hills, where the trees thinned into wide open fields. And then he saw them. They came in formation, tight, disciplined, riders side by side in staggered pairs, headlights off in deference to the sun, leather jackets bearing faded insignias of units most people couldn't name but would instantly recognize for what they were. Special Forces, Rangers, SEALs, Airborne. A few wore no identifying mark at all, their past stamped only in the lines of their faces and the way they held their shoulders, like men who'd spent decades preparing for moments like this. At their head rode Colonel James Battle Jack Murphy. His bike was a custom build, all matte black and steel, the kind of machine that sounded like rolling thunder and moved like it had something to prove. Murphy hadn't changed much. Silver hair cut short, aviators perched on his nose, and a look on his face that said the mission was already understood. He didn't slow down as he entered town. The column behind him kept pace. The entire street shook under the weight of their arrival. Over 200 bikes, each one a message. Not to the vultures, to the town, to the people. You are not alone. The residents of Thunder Creek emerged slowly from their homes one by one, standing on porches and sidewalks. Some raised their hands in quiet greeting. Others just watched, stunned. Kids stood with mouths open, eyes wide. A few elders stepped off their lawns and saluted, not because they were told to, but because something inside them stirred and rose like a reflex, like a call to something they thought had long been buried. Frank met Murphy in front of Keller's. No words at first, just a handshake that gripped hard, the kind shared by men who had held each other up through hell. Murphy looked around at the town, at the civilians watching, at the veterans already embedded at checkpoints and rooftops. You started without me, he said with a grin. Had to give them a taste, Frank replied. Couldn't let Torch think we were bluffing. Murphy nodded, face hardening. Not much of a bluff left now. As the newly arrived veterans dismounted and began filtering into the town structure, some heading to reinforce the store, others integrating with perimeter teams, it became clear that this wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was infrastructure, training, experience. These weren't men who came to visit. They came to stay. They brought comms equipment, med kits, supplies, even generators. Cooper met them with maps and current patrol rotations. Torres updated them on choke points and escape routes. The whole town was being fortified, not with walls, but with people who knew how to defend something worth keeping. Torch watched from the top floor of the Vulture's compound, eyes narrowed behind smeared binoculars. When the rumble first started, he'd thought it was trucks. Then, as the first column crested the hill, his chest had tightened with disbelief. "Number no way," he muttered. But then they kept coming, and coming, and coming. "Boss," Razor said quietly behind him, "that's a force." Torch didn't answer, couldn't. His mind was chewing through the weight of it. 200? Maybe more? These weren't weekend warriors or militia types looking to posture. This was coordinated, precise, military. What the hell did Keller call in? No one answered, because they were all thinking the same thing. If one man, one retired vet with a flag and a phone, could bring this to their doorstep, then everything they'd built wasn't power. It was a house of cards, and someone had just flipped the table. Back in town, Murphy stepped into Mary Ellen's diner and was met with silence. The place was packed, locals on one side, veterans on the other, but every eye turned when he walked in. Frank followed behind, nodding to Mary Ellen, who stood behind the counter, white apron freshly pressed. She gave Murphy a tight smile. "Coffee?" "Always." As she poured, Murphy turned to face the room. "Some of you know me, some don't. Name's Murphy, served with Frank in Vietnam. Led men in a few other places since. I'm not here to tell you how to live your lives. I'm here because a man I trust said this town was worth protecting, and I believe him. I believe you." He paused, let that settle, then added, "But this isn't charity. This isn't a favor. If we're going to do this right, it needs to come from you too. That means standing together. That means organizing. That means turning this town into a place that can't be shaken by the next gang or the next crisis or the next loudmouth who thinks fear makes him powerful. The diner stayed quiet, but there were nods. From farmers, from waitresses, from teenagers leaning against the wall, eyes wide with something new, purpose. Murphy looked over at Frank. We show them what real protection looks like. Frank sipped his coffee, eyes steady. Time to finish what we started. That afternoon, Thunder Creek transformed again. Veterans met with local volunteers. Townsfolk who'd never fired a shot learned to spot cover, secure entrances, communicate clearly. Patrols began walking Main Street not with swagger, but with purpose. Mary Ellen fed everyone who came through her door. Tom Mason turned his garage into a makeshift repair bay for the veterans' bikes and gear. Even the teenagers got involved, running messages, carrying supplies, watching corners. And still, the flag flew above Keller's Hardware, scarred but undefeated. Torch saw the shift, and in that shift he saw the end of his reign. But he wasn't ready to go quietly. He had one more move left. And in the quiet of his compound, he began to build it. Not with bikers or fists, but with fire. Because if he couldn't own Thunder Creek, he'd make damn sure no one else did. And in that final gamble, he wouldn't just threaten a flag. He'd threaten everything it stood for. The sky turned the color of old steel as the final hour approached. Clouds rolled low and heavy over Thunder Creek, pressing down on the rooftops like the weight of what was coming. The town was quiet, but not asleep. Inside homes and shops, veterans moved with silent precision. Radios crackled with updates. Perimeters were checked and rechecked. Civilians stayed indoors by choice, not fear. Their windows shuttered but eyes alert. This wasn't panic. This was preparation. Every heart in Thunder Creek beat a little faster, not because they didn't know what was coming, but because they did. At Keller's Hardware, the old store had become a command post. Tactical maps covered the back walls. Radios buzzed as code names moved across frequencies. Delta North holding. Echo 5 established. Contact East Trail confirmed. Distance 400 yards. Frank Keller stood at the center of it all, eyes on the map, one hand resting on the same table where he used to count nails and ring up cans of paint. Around him, men he'd once led through jungles and war zones now stood again, not as relics of history, but as living proof of what experience, discipline, and brotherhood could still achieve. Colonel Murphy entered from the rear, wiping rain off his glasses. "It's confirmed," he said. "Torch has locked himself inside the compound. Got maybe a dozen loyalists with him. He's not rallying anymore. He's collapsing." Frank nodded, slow and steady. "That makes him dangerous." "Yeah," Murphy replied, "but desperate men make mistakes." Outside, the streets were lined with quiet strength. The newly arrived veterans formed the outer ring, keeping the compound contained. Local volunteers, now trained in basic comms and positioning, manned secondaries, ready to guide civilians if evacuation was needed. And inside the town, the original Ghosts, Frank's old unit, had taken position. They knew how this kind of ending unfolded. They'd seen it before in places without names where tyrants tried to burn everything on their way out. In the compound, Torch paced like a trapped animal. The walls felt smaller now, the graffiti-covered floors less like a throne room and more like a cell. Razor had stopped responding to his commands. Twitch was gone, vanished sometime during the night. Only a handful remained, and even they were jittery, shifting from foot to foot, watching the barricaded windows like men waiting for ghosts to come through the walls. Torch held the detonator tight in his fist. Small, plastic, unimpressive to look at. But it had the power to ignite everything he'd planted. Fuel drums in the basement, propane tanks hidden beneath the stairwells, charges wired to structural beams. He had one play left. If he couldn't rule Thunder Creek, he would erase it. Burn it down to black ash and blame the soldiers. Paint them as aggressors. Martyrs always looked better in stories than in history. But even Torch, in the back of his mind, knew the truth. This wouldn't end in glory. It would end in smoke, And even if the fire took them all, it wouldn't erase what had already happened. The town had turned, the people had risen, and Frank Keller had reminded everyone, veterans, civilians, even his enemies, what strength really looked like when it wasn't about fear. The final move came just after sunset. Frank stepped out from Keller's, rain drizzling on his shoulders, and began walking toward the compound, alone. No radio, no weapon in sight. He moved slowly, deliberately, eyes fixed ahead. As he reached the halfway mark, Murphy's voice crackled through the earpieces of the men in position. "Hold your fire. No movement until signal. Let him do what he came here to do." Inside the compound, Torch watched from the second-story window. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. What the hell is he doing? Frank stopped 20 feet from the gate and called out, voice clear and calm. "You've got one more chance, Torch. You let the boys walk out, you surrender the detonator, and we end this without a body count." Torch slammed his fist against the window frame. "I ain't surrendering to a bunch of has-beens." "You're not surrendering to us," Frank replied. "You're surrendering to the truth, that your time's over, that the town you tried to break doesn't belong to fear anymore." A moment passed, then two. Rain pattered on rooftops. Behind Frank, the town held its breath. Then, from inside the compound, a figure moved, slowly, hands raised. It was Scorpion, no patch, no weapons. He stepped into the open and dropped a bundle on the wet ground. A set of wires, a remote, and a weathered, fuel-stained map of the building's interior. "He wired the place," Scorpion said. "But he's bluffing. The detonator's not even armed yet." Frank didn't flinch. "Go! Get clear!" More followed. One by one the holdouts emerged, guilt etched into their faces. Men who had believed in power through fear now realized what they'd built was nothing more than a burning bridge. A last stand with no ground left behind it. That left one man. Torch stood alone, eyes locked on the small device in his hand. He could still do it. Press the button. Take everything and everyone with him. Leave a crater as his legacy. He whispered to himself, "They'll remember me." But the truth hit harder than the rain ever could. They wouldn't, not the way he wanted. His story would be a cautionary tale, his name a footnote. Because real legacies aren't built from fire and broken glass, they're built from sacrifice, service, unity, and so, in a final act of defiance that was more surrender than vengeance, Torch threw the detonator against the wall, shattering it in a dozen useless pieces. Then he sat down on the floor, back against the wall, and waited. The police moved in first. The veterans didn't need to. Their job was done. When Chief Hawkins cuffed Torch and walked him past Frank, the two locked eyes. No hatred, no triumph, just the unspoken finality of a battle resolved. "You lost," Frank said quietly. Torch looked away. "I know." By nightfall, the compound was secured. No explosives, no resistance, just silence. And in that silence, Thunder Creek exhaled. Slowly, fully. For the first time in months. Frank stood again beneath the flagpole. The new flag, gifted by a fellow vet from out west, flapped in the breeze. This one had flown over a base in the Korangal Valley. Now it flew here, over a town that had faced its fear, stood its ground, and reclaimed its soul. Murphy joined him, a tired smile on his face. "You know, when you made that call, I figured we'd get in a few punches and be gone. But you didn't want to win a fight. You wanted to change something." Frank nodded. "Winning is just a moment. Change, that lasts." And it did. Over the following weeks, the veterans helped rebuild. The town held community meetings, not in fear, but in purpose. A veterans outreach chapter was established. A youth mentorship program launched. Patrols gave way to training. Police and vets worked together. And slowly, the scars of what had happened began to heal, not with time, but with effort. Torch would face trial, his loyalists too. But even they, especially they, now lived with a new understanding of what real power looked like. It wasn't chaos, It wasn't intimidation. It was the quiet strength of people who refused to be broken. And Frank? He raised the flag every morning, same way he always had. But now, he wasn't the only one standing beneath it, because the town had remembered. And the ghosts? They never really left.